Good evening and welcome to the Howard Liddell Memorial Lecture 2017 on the life and legacy of Barry Commoner. These lectures are held on behalf of CEDA and in memory of Howard Liddell, one of CEDA's founders in 1991. Howard was an internationally renowned ecological architect. He was also the author of a book, Eco-Minimalism, the antidote to eco-bling. However, when he died in 2013, he was working on a second book, Eco-Max, which was intended to give voice to the many ecological ideas that are perhaps underrepresented in public debate. As his widow, I took it on board to complete this unfinished business, which I'm doing by promoting an annual event on each of Howard's ecological heroes. So, to Barry Commoner. Barry Commoner was a scientist, a socialist, and an ecologist. He is recognised as a founder of modern ecology. In 1970, the New York Times called him one of the most provocative thinkers and mobilisers in making environmentalism a people's political cause. He was a scientist activist who recognised the toxic consequences of America's post-World War II technology boom. And he led a national debate over the public's right to be informed about the risks and make decisions about them. He believed that science should be fully accessible to everyone. His books are exemplars of clear writing that are both scientifically accurate and committed to social justice. They are sadly out of print, but second-hand copies are readily available. He was born on May 28, 1917 in New York, the son of Jewish immigrants, making this 2017 his centenary year, which to my great surprise has passed almost unnoticed. He put himself through Columbia University, earning honours in zoology and gaining a PhD in cellular biology. He taught for 2 years at Queen's College, New York, and served in the Naval Air Corps in World War II. Once demobbed, he went to teach at the faculty of Washington University in St. Louis. He had a reputation as a brilliant teacher and a painstaking researcher into viruses, cell metabolism, and the effects of radiation on living tissue. He has a significant list of achievements as a cellular biologist. However, he found a political voice in the 1950s as a leader of the campaign against nuclear bomb testing. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune in 1993, he said, "The Atomic Energy Commission turned me into an environmentalist." From 1946 to 1951, the US tested 16 nuclear bombs in secrecy and on the assumption that the harmful effects would simply dissipate. But then, following heavy rainfall in New York in 1953, many scientists noticed an increase in background radiation, and they began testing soil, air, rain, and food. They found radiation above normal background levels everywhere they looked. The government was indifferent to the high levels of strontium-90 in the atmosphere, eventually conceding that the human health risks were limited to the risks of ingesting bone splinters with meat products. To Commoner's fury, either denying, ignoring, or simply ignorant of the facts of how strontium-90 travels with calcium. He led a campaign that examined concentrations of radiation in milk. He documented concentrations of strontium-90 in the baby teeth of thousands of children. and very quickly set in train events that brought problems of nuclear fallout to a generation, which contributed directly to the adoption of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. He was a lasting opponent of nuclear power because no one could win and because of its radioactive waste. He scorned the idea of pollution credit swaps because industry would have to be fouling the environment in the first place to be rewarded, thoroughly believing that pollution can only be prevented. The experience made him very aware that humanity had the ability to poison our world on a scale never before possible. He led other campaigns to identify the causes of smog, which of course turned out to be cars. And then in the 1960s, as founder of the Centre for the Biology of Natural Systems, he brought that understanding to his study of other kinds of pollution. He led a staff drawn from many disciplines in investigating, among other things, lead poisoning in slums, the ecology of ghetto rats, the economics of conventional versus organic farming, and the pollution of rivers by fertiliser leaching. Lake Erie had been declared dead, and identifying the cause of eutrophication led directly to the banning of phosphates from detergents. In 1966, Commoner warned that humanity's relationship with the Earth systems was in crisis. He went on to compile some statistics showing dramatic increases in production after 1945 in synthetic fibres, plastics, aluminium, pesticides. But he also compiled statistics on production that declined in the same period. By including both increases and decreases, Commoner was making a very important point. If this was simply a growth issue, perhaps driven by population increase, then all products should have increased. In fact, production and pollution had not only increased much more rapidly than population since 1945, the kinds of goods produced had changed radically. New production technologies had displaced old ones. Soap powder had been displaced by synthetic detergents, natural fibres such as cotton and wool by synthetic ones. Railroad freight had been displaced by trucks, returnable bottles by non-returnable ones. Per capita production had remained about constant, but the amount of harvested acreage had decreased. Fertiliser had displaced land. The environmental crisis, said Commoner, wasn't just bigger, it was different. The industrial machine was driven by stuff that created pollution that didn't go to Earth. And the root problem, Commoner argued, was an economic system that puts profit ahead of the health of people and planet. Although he believed that private business does not have a perverse affection for pollution, but production based on the new technology is simply more profitable than production based on the old technology it has replaced. He then went on to explain. The decades before the war saw revolutionary advances in basic science, physics and chemistry. Much of the science was adopted for military purposes during the war, but then rapidly moved into industrial and agricultural production after it. The growing privatisation of research saw science take a back seat to projects that held short-range promise of marketable technologies, emphasised profits with little regard to consequences. And then this process was hastened by the flood of cheap oil from Saudi Arabia after 1948 and led to a massive expansion of petrochemical and related industries, energy producing products and waste that nature could not recycle, stimulated a huge expansion in the amount of energy used in production. Low energy manufacturing gave way to high energy processes, and natural materials were replaced by synthetic ones. that required petroleum as raw material for energy. World War II is therefore a great divide between a scientific revolution that preceded it and a technological revolution that followed it. And the consequences: greenhouse gases, synthetic fertilizers, toxic waste, and a proliferation of non-biodegradable materials. Note, it's not yet 1970. In 1970, the year of the first Earth Day, Time magazine put Dr. Cominer on its cover. Excuse me. He devoted a chapter of the closing circle to connections between high rates of profit and practices that are particularly stressful towards the environment, concluding that an economic system which is fundamentally based on private transactions rather than social ones is no longer appropriate and increasingly ineffective in managing the vital social good, the ecosphere. He stood for the US presidency in 1980 as the head of the Citizens Party on the basis of 4 unbending laws of ecology. Everything is connected to everything else, everything must go somewhere, nature knows best, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. But he made little impact, and as we know, Ronald Reagan won. Cominer's overarching concern was not ecology as such, but rather a radical idea of social justice, in which everything was indeed connected to everything else. He believed that environmental pollution, war, and racial and sexual inequality needed to be addressed as related issues of a central problem. Noting the success of movements that had promoted civil rights, sexual equality, organised labour, environmentalism, and an end to the war in Vietnam, he said, one might think that if they would only get together, they could remake the country. He insisted that the planet's future depended on industries learning not to make mess in the first place, rather than trying to clear it up. And he believed that scientists could not wash their hands of moral responsibility for the side effects of new processes or products. He moved the centre from St. Louis to Queen's College in 1981, and he remained in the thick of things, helping to set up New York City's trash recycling programme and defending it against critics who declared that recycling law was irresponsible. I think we're all familiar with the idea that we should, as designers, be responsible for what we specify. The fact that we may be transferring the liability for the toxins in this room into the lungs of small people, or these products as a liability into the future. But we're also responsible as purchasers of things which will not go to Earth. My favourite may well be the contents of a packet of sushi, where not only do we have something that will never go to Earth, but is specifically designed as a toxin to the natural environment. In many ways, Cominer could be said to have predicted the problems we have today. He remained convinced that an educated public could end the ongoing and ultimately suicidal war with the planet by imposing social control over decisions about what to produce and how to produce it. He was also a holist. I quote, "I don't believe in environmentalism as the solution to anything. What I believe is that environmentalism illuminates the things that need to be done to solve all of the problems together. For example, if you're going to revise the productive system to make cars or anything else in such a way as to suit the environmental necessities, at the same time, why not see to it that women earn as much as men for the same work?" It seems to me that a screening of a plastic ocean is both a fitting and timely memorial to remind us that everything must go somewhere. Thank you so much for your attention.